Hi, I'm S.G. Brownlow. Recently, I was reading a woo-woo kind of article somewhere, and they were bringing up an old psychology experiment to support a point they were trying to make. And I didn't really agree with the point, but I thought the experiment was really interesting because it actually demonstrates something that I'd like to talk about. And this experiment was from, I think, the 50s, behaviorists. And what they had done is they had built a big box with a bunch of experimental rats in it. And what they did was that every so often they would give these rats a whiff of cherry blossoms, just the smell of cherry blossoms, and then they would shake the box somehow. And it was like an earthquake for these rats. And sure enough, it only took a few times of having the whiff of cherry blossoms and then the whole box shaking before these rats were terrified every time that they smelled cherry blossoms. Well, that's pretty standard behaviorism. We've all kind of heard of experiments like that. But what was really interesting about this particular experiment is that the experimenter then took the rats and separated them and put them with other rats who had not been part of the original experiment. And what they discovered then was that the newborn rats that resulted when these rats mated all were terrified of cherry blossoms. Just the smell of them would terrify them, just like they had been in the original experiment. And they kept doing this, and they looked at 6 generations of rats. And even in the 6th generation, these young rats would smell cherry blossoms and they'd be terrified. And so the writers, their conclusion was that somehow what happens in our families gets coded into our DNA and we pass it down to our offspring and so forth and so on. I don't think there's evidence for that. But I think what there is evidence that we know happens, we're talking about fear here, that what we know about fear in humans is that humans are born with really pretty much one fear, which is loud noises. And within not very long, they also become scared of heights, not being held necessarily really high, but being really high and not knowing whether they might fall off. That scares them. And then at intervals, other things appear. We know they get scared of strangers at a certain age. They get scared of being left alone with, their parents leaving them at a certain age. We know that at some point they get scared of large animals, of things that look like snakes. Those things seem to happen pretty much regardless, but there's not very many of them. And certainly not as many as the number of things that we fear as adults. We learn what to fear by watching the people around us. If everybody else looks scared, then we know that maybe we should be scared, and we try to figure out what they're scared of, and then we become scared of those things. That's how fear is passed on. And by and large, that's kept our species safe. And we've survived because we have learned to pay attention to what other humans are scared of. Within families, it goes much deeper than fear, though, because within families, within any culture, and a family is certainly at least a subculture, within any culture, there are always rules about how you're supposed to feel in certain situations and what is supposed to elicit what emotion and how you're supposed to express it. And by the time you get down to the family level, you're really starting to talk about things like how parents respond to different emotional situations. So if, for instance, mom can never admit she's wrong because being wrong makes her feel inadequate and she doesn't deal with inadequacy very well, the chances are that we're not going to learn to deal with our own feelings of inadequacy well either. And if dad is constantly frustrated because somehow dad hasn't realized how to unfuse the frustration and pull apart the strands of sadness and anger and deal with those productively, then the chances are that we're going to be frustrated because we're not going to have learned how to pull that apart and deal with anger and sadness productively. And so we're going to do the same things as mom and dad, not because we're rewarded, not because it's in our DNA, not because it's genetic, not because people told us to, but because people haven't ever taught us how not to. They haven't ever taught us how to regulate our emotions productively, and so we never learn how to regulate our emotions productively. And so because of that, the chances are that your emotional hang-ups are very similar to the ones that your grandparents and great-grandparents had. And if you don't do something about it within yourself, then your grandkids and great-grandkids are likely to have the same emotional hang-ups as you do. So if you've realized at this point, wow, I've kind of got a responsibility to future generations, not just to myself, good. When you're ready to do something about it, contact me. Let's take care of your offspring.